Okay, let's unpack this. This is a monumental, just a collision of minds. Friedrich Nietzsche and Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Two absolute titans.
Right, and they're standing at this gateway to modern existence, asking these incredibly searing questions about morality, freedom, the death of God, all of it.
The big ones.
But here's the critical piece of history, the thing we really need to establish for this deep dive. Nietzsche only came across Dostoevsky's work years after the Russian novelist was already dead.
That's a fact that perpetually confuses scholars, and it's absolutely essential to our analysis. Dostoevsky died in 1881.
Right.
Nietzsche was only introduced to his writings, and specifically, it was a French translation of Notes from the Underground in 1887.
Wow.
And yet the overlap in their concepts, even some of the specific phrases, their philosophical concerns, it's also startlingly precise that many early scholars just assumed Nietzsche must have been directly responding to him.
Which is impossible.
It's chronologically impossible. We know for a fact that Nietzsche's most potent philosophy, the core of his work, was already formulated well before 1887.
So if they weren't reading each other, how do we explain this profound unspoken dialogue happening across a continent? How do they end up wrestling with the exact same crises of the modern soul?
Well, the only way to really understand this dialogue, to see it clearly, is to adopt a very specific critical lens. And that lens comes from the great French intellectual historian René Girard. Girard's work focused on this idea of mimesis. It's the concept that human desire isn't autonomous. It's not something that just springs from within us. We copy it. We learn to desire things because we see a model or a rival desiring them first.
It's a social process.
Entirely. And by applying that Girardian framework, we can stop looking for, direct intellectual borrowing and start looking at the shared cultural and psychological forces that were pushing on both men. The shared traumas, the shared blueprints. They were being forced to address identical dilemmas of status, rivalry, and self-assertion at the same time.
So our mission today, then, is to dive into the sources that reveal this shared foundation. We're going to trace these astonishing parallels in their early lives.
The traumatic circumstances that really forged them.
Exactly. And then ultimately, how their philosophical avatars, the Übermensch, the Overman on one side, and the underground man on the other, came to embody two radically opposed responses to weakness, to failure, and to this devastating dynamic of mimetic desire you just mentioned.
It's a story of two paths, starting from an almost identical place. And as you said, one leads to a kind of hard-won redemption, and the other leads to absolute destruction.
When you really look at the first half of their lives, the biographical blueprint that Nietzsche and Dostoevsky share is, it's uncanny. It feels less like random chance and more like a carefully crafted setup.
It does. Like something was ensuring that both men would be grappling with the exact same internal demons of self-worth and authority.
So where does it begin?
It begins in the home, with their family structure. Both were born as these incredibly sensitive, intellectually precocious kids into homes that were just dominated by these powerful conservative fathers.
Right. Stern patriarchs.
Very stern. Nietzsche's father was a strict Lutheran pastor. He expected this intense intellectual and spiritual rigor from his young son. So Friedrich was instilled with this deep respect for piety, for conservative values he would later, violently reject. Dostoevsky's father, Mikhail, was a military doctor. He was a man of, intense mood swings and severe discipline. And that instilled in young Fyodor a constant sense of guilt, of obligation, and frankly fear when it came to authority figures.
So you have these two sensitive boys, and in both cases, they're looking for an escape from this very stern patriarchal atmosphere.
And they find it in the same place. Books, reading became their sanctuary from a very early age. But then comes the shared defining trauma that just completely destabilizes their entire world. The early and violent loss of the father.
For Nietzsche, it was a bit more conventional, but still deeply shaping.
Yes. His father died very suddenly. Friedrich was barely 5 years old, and this left him to be raised in this entirely matriarchal household. His mother, his grandmother, two unmarried aunts.
The physical patriarch is gone.
He's gone, but the shadow of this revered, almost saintly pastor remained immense. Nietzsche spent his entire life trying to escape this ghost of conservative piety. He's laboring under the pressure to become the next great man of faith, even as his atheism is growing stronger and stronger.
It creates this internal split.
A huge one. The sensitive, dutiful boy is constantly at war with the increasingly rebellious philosopher inside.
Dostoevsky's loss, though, was far more traumatic.
Oh, much more so. The story, or the rumor, is that Mikhail Dostoevsky was murdered by his own serfs during a drunken rage. The precise circumstances are still a bit mysterious.
And for young Fyodor.
For him, the shock, combined with the immense guilt from his own very complicated, often resentful relationship with his father, it became this psychological weight he carried his entire life. So for both men, their entire foundation, their sense of order, authority, masculine identity, it's just violently shattered in childhood.
And the parallels just keep going into their early 20s.
They do. Both men had these brief and ultimately very negative experiences with the military.
Right. Dostoevsky was forced into the military engineering academy.
A place he absolutely detested. He felt totally alienated by the mechanical, pragmatic environment. All he wanted was literature. So he felt like a complete failure in a world that just prioritized practical discipline and utility over art.
And Nietzsche. He served briefly, too.
Very briefly, in the military medical corps. He was quickly discharged because of his chronic illness, this persistent bodily weakness that would just plague him for the rest of his life and stand in such stark contrast to his later philosophy of strength.
Okay, now we get to one of the most specific, almost impossibly symbolic, shared elements.
The horse.
The traumatic experience with a horse. The sources show that around the same age, both men were just haunted by an incident with a severely mistreated horse. It's almost too perfect a symbol.
It is uncanny. For Dostoevsky, the trauma was this overwhelming sense of pity and injustice he witnessed. He describes it in his early notes, and then later, famously, he recreates this horrific, detailed beating of a weak mare in a dream sequence.
In Crime and Punishment.
In Crime and Punishment, yes.
Yeah.
Raskolnikov's dream. And that scene is pivotal for Raskolnikov. It's a moment where this overwhelming, raw, visceral pity breaks through his calculating, rationalist philosophy of self-assertion. For Dostoevsky, that moment of pity, as painful as it is ultimately a step toward redemption, toward recognizing shared suffering.
But for Nietzsche, the connection to the horse trauma would become, it becomes literal and final.
Utterly final. It marks the moment of his descent into madness. For Nietzsche, the horse symbolized power, freedom, the natural Dionysian world he embraced. So the sight of a horse being beaten was, for him, the ultimate symbol of civilized cruelty, of the destruction of noble instincts, a fate he felt he was also experiencing.
Okay, so after all this shared trauma and these parallel experiences, both men have this meteoric rise, and it happens at the exact same point in their lives.
Age 24. It's incredible. Dostoevsky publishes Poor Folk, and it gets immediate, rapturous, critical acclaim. He is instantly elevated into the elite literary circles of Petersburg. They're heralding him as the heir apparent to Gogol.
The next big thing.
The next big thing. And at the exact same time, Nietzsche, thanks to the influence of his mentor, Ritschl, is fast-tracked into the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel.
He becomes the youngest full professor in the entire history of that university.
Maybe in all of Europe. And this is before he even completed his doctorate. A stunning rise.
A stunning rise for two men who were, up to that point, defined by early trauma and insecurity. But this elite status, it wasn't sustainable for either of them.
Not at all. The disillusionment set in almost immediately. Dostoevsky quickly alienated the fickle critics and the influential figures like Belinsky. He slides into intellectual obscurity and eventually falls in with revolutionary socialist circles.
A choice that proved to be catastrophic.
Absolutely. And Nietzsche, he finds his academic environment to be completely stifling. His first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, is just savaged by the critics. He becomes bitter and feels trapped by the very institution that had just celebrated him.
And this failure leads directly to what you've called the decade of obscurity and exile.
For Dostoevsky, the consequences were material and crushing. Arrest, a terrifying mock execution, 4 brutal years of hard labor in a Siberian prison.
Unimaginable.
Followed by 6 years of mandatory conscription and exile in the empty center of Russia. He was living in the most abject physical conditions, stripped of everything except a copy of the New Testament.
And Nietzsche's exile. It wasn't a physical prison, but...
No, it was physically comfortable. He spent 9 years teaching in Switzerland, but it was an intellectual and psychological purgatory. He wrote very little of significance during this time. He felt isolated, he misunderstood his own ambitions, and he was constantly wrestling with his worsening health. The sources depict a man who is completely unable to reconcile his internal philosophical dreams with his external reality as this respectable, sickly professor.
So both men finally emerge from this decade of exile in their mid-30s.
They do, but they choose radically divergent paths. Dostoevsky, having been physically and spiritually broken, rebuilds himself through humility, through confession, through faith. He sets himself on the road to hard-won redemption and his greatest masterpieces.
Nietzsche.
Nietzsche emerges from his intellectual exile, determined to deny the weakness and suffering he had experienced. He resolves to build a philosophy of sheer strength, affirming defiance, a path that ultimately led to his mental and physical destruction.
Okay, so the stage is now perfectly set for the actual moment, the discovery of Dostoevsky's work by Nietzsche. But before we get to that, we have to pause on the foundational psychological insight that Dostoevsky articulated, because this is what makes the whole connection possible. He was obsessed with self-deception.
That's absolutely right. Dostoevsky understood that the greatest insights a novelist can provide are often painful. And they're painful because we are inherently, fundamentally dishonest with ourselves.
We tell ourselves stories.
Constantly, he captured this perfectly early in Notes from the Underground. He notes, and I'm paraphrasing here, there are things a man is afraid to tell, even to himself, and every decent man has a number of such things stored away in his mind. He believed modern man was perpetually engaged in this grand performance of dignity and rationality.
Even while living in a hole of pettiness.
Exactly, living in his own self-made underground.
And it was that very hole that Nietzsche was metaphorically digging himself out of when he stumbles upon the Russians.
Yes, the fateful discovery happens in January 1887. Nietzsche is in Nice, in southern France. He's on one of his periodic, desperate searches for a comfortable, warm apartment that might alleviate his chronic migraines and his vomiting. He walks into a small bookshop
and finds a volume titled The Underground Spirit, containing 2 stories by Dostoevsky.
And this is where the universe, or fate, depending on your perspective, seems to just conspire to make this meeting inescapable. You have to consider coincidence number 1.
Right.
Nietzsche had literally just finished writing a new preface for his book, Dawn. The very first sentence of that preface began with this statement of philosophical intent. In this book, you will find an underground man at work.
An underground man at work.
And the nameless, bitter narrator of Dostoevsky's book is known only officially as the underground man. The title of the book in his hand seemed to be addressed directly to him, personally.
And the coincidences didn't stop there. The volume also had a second story, The Landlady.
Yes. So if Nietzsche opened that book and turned to the second story first, he would have encountered coincidence number 2. The very first line of The Landlady reads, Ordininoff had finally decided to change his apartment.
I mean, you can't make this up.
You really can't. And for a philosopher who is increasingly isolated, riddled with physical pain, and leaning heavily into a kind of philosophical fatalism, these were not just random events.
He's seeing patterns everywhere.
He is. By this time, in 1887, Nietzsche had become intensely superstitious. He genuinely believed, and he wrote this, there is no longer any element of chance in my life. So for a man seeking validation for his loneliness, this immediate, precise correspondence, a fellow philosopher of the darkness, a fellow apartment seeker was, as the sources note, irresistible. It confirmed his belief that he was living under the direct guidance of higher fate.
The shared sense of infirmity, of sickness, must have cemented this connection even further.
Absolutely. By 1887, Nietzsche's health was in terminal decline. He was nearly blind, constantly medicated, just afflicted by these overwhelming, debilitating migraines. He knew his body was breaking down.
And the first line of Notes from the Underground.
I am a sick man, I am a wicked man, I am an unattractive man. That line, I am a sick man, must have just resonated like a thunderclap.
And both of them took this peculiar, defiant pride in their illnesses.
They did. They both refused orthodox medical treatment. Nietzsche's mantra was, of course, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And the underground man, similarly, uses his illness as proof of his superiority. He's too sensitive, he's too aware of the suffering of existence to conform to the rational expectations of doctors or society.
And Nietzsche would have seen his own life just perfectly mirrored in the underground man's descriptions.
Perfectly. The character survives on a modest fixed income, he's retired early, withdrawn entirely from social life. He feels more sensitive and fundamentally more intelligent than all the stupid, successful people around him.
Right. He attributes their worldly success to their sheer dullness, their willingness to be guided by simple, rational self-interest.
And this was a precise description of Nietzsche's own post-Basel self-imposed exile.
But the core philosophical dialogue, the true genius of this coincidence, lies in their avatars.
Yes, the avatars. Nietzsche's great creation, the figure he invested all his hope and ambition into, was Zarathustra, the voice of Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
And Zarathustra is exactly 40 years old.
Yeah.
He spent 10 years in perfect isolation on a mountaintop, and he descends with gifts of wisdom to preach the Übermensch.
The Overman, the figure of absolute, autonomous, radically free self-overcoming.
But Dostoevsky, writing Notes from the Underground, also at exactly age 40, having just emerged from a decade of exile, provides his philosophical avatar.
The underground man. But he's a dark mirror. Instead of descending from a spiritual height, the underground man is crawling up out of his hole, a hole he built for himself.
That contrast is the entire point.
It is the entire point. The underground man is the Übermensch failure state. Nietzsche's Overman is supposed to rise above mass morality and spite to affirm his will and live creatively. The underground man is the man who possesses the rational knowledge of radical freedom. He understands that if God is dead, he can invent his own values.
But he's completely paralyzed by his own self-contempt and spite.
Exactly. He's radically free, but he refuses to exercise that freedom because he knows if he makes a choice, he might fail. And failure is absolutely intolerable. So he chooses paralysis. He chooses spite. He proves his freedom only by doing things that harm himself or prove that he's a walking contradiction.
He's the ultimate spiteful intellect.
That's a perfect way to put it. He demonstrates that radical freedom doesn't automatically lead to greatness. It can just as easily lead to perpetual narcissistic paralysis. Dostoevsky's work provides this devastating, line-by-line practical rebuttal to the philosophy of unbridled self-assertion that Nietzsche was just beginning to codify. It showed the true, pathetic, often petty nature of the self-proclaimed superior man, the man who rejects the comforts of conventional morality but finds no actual comfort in his chosen solitude.
So when we place Nietzsche's life story against the philosophy he was writing, we run into what the sources call this tragic, almost unbearable contrast.
It's stark. Nietzsche, the author, projects this image of the fearless warrior poet, the embodiment and strength, will, defiance.
The Nietzsche the man. He was almost the physical manifestation of weakness.
He was sickly, timid, insecure, and ultimately unsuccessful in nearly every personal relationship he ever pursued. His philosophy, the theory of the will to power, when you view it against his actual biography, it starts to look less like an objective description of reality and more like a desperate compensatory defense mechanism.
Something designed to overcome the feelings of weakness he was experiencing constantly.
Precisely. And this is why that Girardian lens is so illuminating, particularly when we examine his relationship with Richard Wagner.
Right. So Nietzsche gets elevated into Wagner's orbit in the late 1860s. He's only 24, and Wagner is already a living legend.
He is. Wagner isn't just creating music. He's creating a full-blown cultural movement, a cult of personality that's charged with forging this new, heroic Germanic cultural heritage. And Nietzsche, despite his inherent shyness, is just swept up by this magnetic charisma.
And this is the perfect arena for exploring that mimetic desire you mentioned.
The perfect arena. Girard argues our desires are triangular. We rarely desire an object, let's call it X directly. We desire X because a mediator, or a rival in this case, Wagner, shows us that X is desirable.
And the object of this intense mediated desire within Wagner's circle was Cosima.
Cosima, Wagner's mistress and soon-to-be wife. And you have to understand her position. She was married to the famous conductor Hans von Bülow,
Who was also a devotee of Wagner.
yes. And Cosima's father was Franz Liszt, the great composer, another admirer of Wagner. She was the absolute epicenter of cultural aspiration and desire.
So the three most important men in Nietzsche's world at that moment are all bound by this complex relationship to Wagner, and they're all circling around Cosima.
She's the desired object, and Wagner is the dominant rival who possesses her. So the young Professor Nietzsche, insecure and ambitious, inevitably.
He falls in love with Cosima.
Of course he does, which makes Wagner his immediate and insurmountable rival.
But this rivalry was never fought openly.
Never. And von Bülow's reaction to being cuckolded perfectly captures this dynamic of mimetic submission. When Cosima publicly left him for Wagner, von Bülow didn't fight. He accepted it with almost religious reverence. He compared himself to the human Theseus giving up the goddess Ariadne to Dionysus, meaning Wagner.
So he's treating the rival not as a man to be killed, but as an immortal god.
A god whose will is beyond human challenge. This is the perfect expression of mediated desire. The rival isn't just stronger, he's sacred. And Nietzsche, despite his growing internal disdain for Wagner's nationalism, was caught in the exact same current.
Which brings us to the famous Christmas of Submission.
1870, shortly after Wagner and Cosima married. It's a painful illustration of Nietzsche's suppressed rivalry. He was invited to celebrate Christmas at their home in Lucerne. It's an exquisite psychological torture, right? Staying under the roof of the woman you love and the man who holds her in absolute thrall.
And the gifts he brought just speak volumes about his internal conflict.
They really do. To Wagner, he gifted a valuable engraving by Albrecht Dürer titled The Night, Death, and the Devil. This was a powerful symbol in German nationalistic culture, a man riding fearlessly through danger. And Wagner, of course, proudly interpreted it as a symbol of himself, riding to save German culture.
Think about that. If you secretly despise the man's politics and you covet his wife, why give him a gift that glorifies his status and reinforces a political agenda you find contemptible?
It speaks to this underlying need to placate and validate the dominant alpha. The closer Nietzsche got to Wagner, the more he despised him intellectually, but the more he submitted to him personally just to maintain proximity to Cosima.
And his gift to Cosima was the manuscript for The Birth of Tragedy.
His first major philosophical work. And the book concluded by suggesting that Wagner was achieving a height similar to the great Greek tragedians, Aeschylus and Sophocles. It was a testament to the rival's artistic genius.
So why? Why signal such, as the sources say, cringing submission, if the will to power is supposed to be paramount? It's a profound psychological contradiction.
It reveals a man trapped in what Girard calls external mediation. He couldn't trust his own desire. It had to be filtered through the rival. He needed Wagner's existence to validate his own ambition and his desire for Cosima.
Okay, let's circle back to the landlady. That story Nietzsche found so compelling. The plot, as we mentioned, mirrored his own humiliation perfectly.
The young, sensitive scholar Ordunov is drawn into the home of the young, lovely Katerina and this mysterious older man, Murin, who controls her completely.
The parallel is stunningly specific.
It is. The climax happens when Ordunov, fueled by his love for Katerina, decides he has to seize the initiative. He has to kill Murin by force. He makes the attempt, but when he's faced with the dominant older man, he completely wilts at the critical moment.
He drops the knife.
He drops the knife. And immediately, Katerina runs to Murin, weeping, and falls at his feet. The old man tells the police that Ordunov is no danger to anyone, precisely because he lacked the sheer aggressive will to kill a stronger man.
And this is Nietzsche's life.
Yeah. To a T. He preached the philosophy of the violent will, but in reality, he never made an open play for Cosima while Wagner was alive. He withdrew, physically, intellectually, and eventually philosophically. His repressed desire turned into this toxic, lifelong obsession.
That final, desperate love letter he wrote to Cosima.
Signing himself Dionysus.
Right. Immediately after his final collapse in 1889. That was the breaking of a man who had suppressed his natural desires for 2 decades.
You know, Dostoevsky, in his early works, Before Siberia, he exhibited the exact same pattern of weakness and submission that we see in the young Nietzsche.
Really? The same dynamic?
Absolutely. His early career is just filled with these protagonists who are the clear loser in a love triangle. They are consistently overpowered by a rival who is older, stronger, and more decisive.
Give me an example.
Perfolk. The protagonist, Devushkin, is desperately in love with Varvara, but he's weak, he's impoverished, he's just paralyzed by indecision. So she ends up agreeing to marry this old man and a brute, but a rich old brute. It's a decision driven by pure necessity.
And instead of fighting for her,
Devushkin's reaction is to scurry around trying to make himself useful. He helps prepare the wedding. He acts as a humble servant to the couple.
wow.
And Dostoevsky, at first, he tried to frame this inaction, this fear, as generosity and devotion in a spirit of self-sacrifice. He tried to convince himself and the reader that this was noble suffering.
But he came to see it differently.
Yes. The later Dostoevsky realized this was just a desperate cover, this weakness, this indecision. It was masking a profound, roaring ocean of resentment directed at the successful rival and at his own inability to act. This self-recognition is what ultimately separated him from Nietzsche.
Because Nietzsche, tragically, never achieved that kind of authentic self-recognition of his own weakness.
Never. And it led directly to his most famous relationship failure, the Lou Salome debacle of 1882.
So Lou Salome, a brilliant and notoriously independent Russian woman, she rejects Nietzsche's marriage proposals. Twice. And yet he agrees to form this bizarre 3-person literary commune, a holy trinity, with her and his friend Paul Ray, who she had also rejected. It's the philosopher of the will, desperately clinging to an arrangement that clearly relegated him to 3rd place.
The humiliation in that episode is just... it's difficult to overstate. It's hard to imagine a more pathetic failure for the theorist of the Übermensch. And it reached its humiliating visual apex when they posed for that now infamous photograph.
Oh, the photograph. Salome is seated in a small two-wheeled cart, holding a whip.
While Nietzsche and Ray stand in front, yoked together with ropes, playing the roles of the whipped horses pulling her.
It is the philosopher of strength, the man who wrote about overcoming weakness, willingly presenting himself as a slave in a mating competition. It is a philosophical portrait of absolute psychological self-betrayal.
And if that weren't enough, Nietzsche, a 38-year-old man, allowed his younger sister, Elizabeth, to chaperone his time with Salome. This guaranteed that the relationship and his desire would be completely neutered and controlled.
So when Salome and Ray finally abandoned him, leaving for Poland without warning,
He sank into a depression so severe he contemplated suicide. He lashed out, blaming everyone, especially his sister, Elizabeth, for interfering writing of a relentless desire for vengeance. He even recognized the psychological peril of this state. He noted, "This conflict is bringing me step by step closer to madness."
this series of personal failures, it just reveals the core contradiction of his philosophy. His doctrine was centered on the autonomy of the will, the strength to define your own values.
The courage to claim your desires without apology.
And yet all three women he loved were already entangled with men he knew. He couldn't initiate desire. His desire had to be validated by the presence of a dominant rival. He was always the loser, yet he preached that the weak and the botched shall perish.
And it was during this exact period of intense suffering, rejection, and physical agony that he wrote The Joyous Science and formulated the concept of eternal recurrence.
The ultimate test.
The ultimate test. What if a demon came to you and said, you must relive this exact life? Every pain, every pleasure, every humiliation, every single second, again and again infinitely. How does a man who has just been photographed as a whipped horse answer that question?
Lou Salome herself observed that the two great lines of Nietzsche's fate were loneliness and suffering.
And the eternal recurrence is the test of whether you are great enough to affirm that suffering. Nietzsche, in his failure to overcome his immediate suffering, turned to the mechanism of revenge.
He was keenly aware of the psychological impulse toward revenge.
Oh, absolutely. He wrote, "It is impossible to suffer without making someone pay for it. Every complaint already contains its revenge." And this brings us to the profound concept he developed to explain the inner psychological life of the weak, resentment.
Okay, we need to define resentment slowly.
Yeah.
Because it's more than just standard resentment.
It's much more. It's the condition of a person trapped in an inferior position. The slave, the cuckold, the loser, who desires revenge on the dominant figures but lacks the physical or societal means to actually take it.
So lacking the ability to act.
The person's soul rots in this condition. They are forced to seek philosophical or moral revenge.
How does that work?
It works by inverting values. If I cannot be strong, then I must define strength as evil. If I cannot attain my desire openly, then I must define open desire as sinful. Nietzsche argued that resentment is what created slave morality. The slave, unable to overcome the master physically, overcomes him spiritually by inventing Christianity, a morality that glorifies pity, humility, turning the other cheek.
So for Nietzsche, this was a philosophical attack on what they despise. His condemnation of pity as the morality of the slave, and his attack on Christianity for preserving whatever is ripe for destruction. It was all based on this theory.
Exactly. Resentment turns the strong man's will to power backwards against himself, making him feel ashamed of his own strength. It ultimately leads the strong to perish through self-contempt, while the weak inherit the earth.
The devastating irony, the tragic core of this deep dive.
Is that when Nietzsche diagnosed the world with resentment, he was providing a clinical, brilliant diagnosis of the exact psychological pattern he himself was exhibiting. In his retreat from Wagner, in his rage over Salome, in his intellectual isolation, he became the very thing his philosophy condemned.
So the paths of Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, which began in this eerie parallel, they achieved their ultimate opposing destinations in their final years. For Dostoevsky, that decade of exile in Siberia, it wasn't just punishment.
No, it was, as the sources suggest, a bucket of ice water thrown over his head. It shattered his early, arrogant, intellectual self.
It was the true crucible.
It was. 4 years of hard labor in a miserable prison with nothing but the New Testament to read, followed by 6 years of military exile. It forced him to confront suffering, humility, true spiritual poverty. It stripped him of his revolutionary ideals and his intellectual vanity.
He met men who had committed unspeakable crimes.
And yet who retained the surprising faith and spiritual depth he'd never seen in the intellectuals of Petersburg.
But the real make-or-break moment came even later, in 1863.
Yes, the triple catastrophe. The death of his beloved wife Maria, the death of his brother Mikhail, and losing every single penny he possessed to a crippling gambling addiction while he was traveling abroad, he was at rock bottom.
And Girard suggested he had only two outcomes at that moment.
Madness or genius? He chose genius. His first great work after this collapse was Notes from the Underground. And crucially, this book wasn't an apologia. It wasn't an attempt to defend his past.
It was a confession.
A raw, brutal, and humiliating confession. He laid bare the pettiness, the spite, the paralysis of his own underground existence for the entire world to judge. And that act of confession was the necessary strength he needed to move forward.
And from that point on, Dostoevsky's life was defined by this hard-won redemption.
It was. He finally overcame his debilitating gambling addiction in 1871, a victory of will that Nietzsche would have envied. He went on to write his historic masterpieces, Demons, The Idiot, and the majestic The Brothers Karamazov.
His stature grew so immense that the Tsar of Russia,
the very man who had sentenced him to death years earlier,
invited Dostoevsky to court to educate his sons.
He achieved this rare form of peace and glory. He died in 1881, a celebrated Russian patriot and Orthodox Christian, grieved by the entire nation. His funeral procession was the largest Moscow had ever seen up to that time. He had returned to his home, his country, and his faith. He was fully reintegrated into the community he had once rejected.
And the ultimate expression of his life's message came on his deathbed.
It did. Knowing his time was short, wanting to impart his final lesson to his children, he asked for a specific passage from the Bible to be read. The parable of the prodigal son.
Why that story?
Because that choice embodies Dostoevsky's final, deepest understanding of his own life. He had been the prodigal son, he had rejected the conventional home, the father's rules, the traditional faith, believing this rejection made him free and autonomous.
And instead he found himself homeless and enslaved.
Eating husks with the swine in Siberia and in the casinos of Europe. The strength, he realized, was not in defiant rejection, but in the humility of return. The act of confessing failure, admitting his arrogance, and returning home resulted in him being welcomed and celebrated. He achieved true genius through repentance.
And Nietzsche, in direct contrast, chose the path of absolute defiance.
To the end. After that triple failure, the Lou Salome episode, he entered his explosive period. He was churning out a book a year, including the first part of Zarathustra.
Which he had to self-publish.
He did. He sent only 40 copies to his closest acquaintances, a testament to his absolute solitude.
And his attacks became increasingly hostile and grandiose.
Directed specifically at the people and institutions that represented his past. Christianity, God is dead, was a deliberate affront to his deeply religious mother, who was just devastated by his philosophy. He brutally attacked Wagner, called Germans stupid and cultureless.
And even invented a Polish noble genealogy for himself to disassociate entirely from his hated German heritage.
This was resentment turning outward, seeking revenge on his own origins.
And by 1888, his behavior was becoming terrifyingly erratic.
His landlord reported him shredding currency in the street. He demanded his room be transformed into a temple because, as he wrote in his final letters, he claimed to have arrived to take God's place. He wrote frequently that nothing happens by chance anymore, believing he was following a necessary destiny, embracing the ultimate affirmation of fate amor fati.
This self-deification.
It was rooted in his philosophy that the formula for human greatness was learning to love one's fate. But his mind was breaking under the weight of the life he was trying to affirm.
And the final collapse occurred in Turin, January 1889.
He was found on the street, weeping hysterically, his arms thrown around the neck of a horse that a man was mercilessly beating.
Which brings us full circle, back to that shared early trauma, the horse incident.
And the sources confirm that this moment in Turin mirrors almost exactly that uphelding, powerful scene of the beaten mare from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment.
A passage Nietzsche had copied into his notebooks.
Verbatim over and over again. Pity. The very thing he condemned as the morality of the slave was the emotion that finally broke his reason.
He went completely insane that day.
And never recovered. He lived out his remaining years cared for by his mother and sister. His last letters were the ultimate expressions of defiance and self-deification, signed either the Crucified or Dionysus. He was fighting a lost cause, and he knew it. He wrote in his autobiography, "I attack only causes that are victorious. I attack only causes against which I cannot expect to find allies. I attack only causes against which I shall stand alone." He paid the ultimate, final price for his defiance.
The symmetry is haunting. It's instructive. You have two men beginning with nearly identical psychological traumas, emerging into the same philosophical void, and they arrive at the same crossroad. The choice between humility and defiance.
And one finds peace and greatness through submission, return, and repentance. Dostoevsky lived as the prodigal son who found the courage to go home.
While Nietzsche fought on to the bitter end, determined to prove the world wrong, to affirm the will, even if it meant paying with his own mind for his philosophy.
You know, the sources, when you see them through Girard's lens, they force you to reconsider the very definition of strength. Consider this provocative image of the two prodigal sons traveling together, eating husks with the swine.
Okay.
One brother breaks. He realizes his arrogance and says, "Let's go home, I'll ask for forgiveness." The other, covered in filth and sores, pulls his head out of the trough with a look of pure contempt. He knows he could be welcomed back, but he chooses destruction because the alternative, that humility of return, is psychologically intolerable.
The meaning embedded in all our foundational hell myths, Job, Prometheus, Sisyphus, the prodigal son, is that when you go up against the final structures of reality or community, you will eventually lose.
Because ultimately, all humans break.
Dostoevsky achieved true, lasting greatness and personal peace through repentance, through the strength of submission and the forgiveness of others.
And Nietzsche achieved a different kind of greatness, the greatness of consequence. He paid his bill down to the last cent for choosing to be wrong.
And that raises an important final question for you, the learner. In a world that consistently demands constant self-assertion and victory and relentless affirmation,
Is the willingness to be truly humbled, to admit one's failure and return home? Is that a far greater and more radical